Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
Well, it's a great pleasure and privilege to have a chance to talk to Johnny Parry, who I've known for many years but never had this kind of conversation with perhaps before. Johnny, tell me when and where you were born.
I was born in London in 1943.
Whenabouts in 1943?
September.
Okay. As an anthropologist, you'll be aware that our ancestors sometimes influence our lives. How far back would you like to go with your ancestors? Often people talk about their grandparents a little bit on either side or both sides. Should we go back any further, or is that...
No, I don't know much about anybody any further back. If I start with my parents, my father came from sort of well-heeled middle-class family, sort of aspiring to be really rather posh and sort of squirearchy types. Was trained in classics at Cambridge, became a civil servant, wrote novels, quite a lot of novels, died when I was very, very young.
Did he write under his own name?
Yes, he did. He was called Dennis Parry. And he used to write these novels on trains as he commuted to his job. And my mother's family is not entirely clear because she was always very cagey about it, but it was a hypogamous union. That is, they were much less posh, the sort of very lower fringes of the middle class perhaps. I think her father, which was always concealed from me as a child, was a tailor in Swansea, had a sort of small tailoring business, but it took me a long time to discover this. And the marriage kind of broke up when I was perhaps 6 or something of that sort. So I was essentially brought up by my mother in what she regarded as straitened circumstances, having made this spectacularly good marriage. And in fact, they weren't straitened circumstances at all. They were just in terms of her expectations. So that's the sort of milieu of two upwardly mobile families, but upwardly mobile from very different starting points.
Tell me something about the characters of your parents as you remember them. I mean, they must have shaped you in various ways. Were they interested in books and ideas?
Well, my father was, but I had extremely little contact with him, beyond the age of 6. I mean, the marriage broke up in a good deal of acrimony, and contact with my father after it broke up and before his death was extremely fraught. I remember ghastly scenes of my mother on one side of the road and my father waiting in the car on the other side because they couldn't talk to each other, and so on. This small child having to cross the road.
Were you the only child?
No, I had an elder sister, for whom it was all, I think partly because she was older, for whom it was much more traumatic than it was for me.
And what was your mother's character, with whom you spent a lot of time? How would you describe her? Is she still alive?
No. She was, it's rather difficult to say in a few words, but she had left school. She'd been a kind of sickly child and had left school at about 14 or 15, so was not at all well educated in a kind of formal sense. She was obviously extremely pretty as a young woman, which enabled her to kind of make this marriage. the marriage was greatly disapproved of by my father's family, so she had to contend with being cold-shouldered and treated as a social climber by her husband's family. She was someone who was always rather socially insecure, I think. That was a very important part of her personality. But later in life, she went to live in Italy on a sort of small income. She could more afford to live in Florence as a lady than she could afford to live in London. And she'd never learnt a foreign language before, but she learnt good, fluent Italian. She went to art classes. So she had a sort of, a real dynamism. She was a strong-willed woman in lots of ways, yes.
Was she supportive of you through your growing up, or more preoccupied with herself?
No, I mean, she was supportive and kind of warm and affectionate and so on. She had a much more conflictual relationship with my sister than with myself, who, as I said, took the divorce and so on much harder.
And then moving back, were there any of your grandparents you were close to at all?
No. My mother's parents were dead by the time I was born. My father's father must have died at about the time I was born, and then my father's mother I did know as a child. She was a dragon, a frightening, tough lady.
Well, we usually go on to your first school. Do you remember anything about your first school or where it was? And
Yes, I think, I think I'd been at some nursery school before, but the first proper school, I was sent to a sort of boys' prep school incredibly early. I think I might still have been 6 or just 7. And I can remember that, this was in the aftermath of the divorce, and that home was not entirely comfortable. And I was absolutely manic about learning to play cricket properly. So, I regarded this as a sort of wonderful opportunity. And,
so you enjoyed that school?
Yes. I mean, on the whole, I had a reasonably happy school life. Academically, not very distinguished or acceptable. I was a sort of sports freak, and that's what I thought was sort of serious. And it wasn't until I was about 16 or 17 and sort of started reading Bertrand Russell essays and so on that I decided that I would like to be an intellectual, which I think I thought probably meant wearing a black sweater and going to coffee bars, etc.
And at that first school, do you remember anything about the teaching, or were there any teachers who either there... Where was the school, by the way? The preparatory school?
It was in Kent, but it burnt down with all the children inside it after I'd been there a couple of years. So it was a dramatic fire. The school then kind of temporarily closed down, and then it moved to Wiltshire.
The children, while being inside, managed to get out?
Yes, yes. There was. I remember being congratulated by the headmaster's wife because I thought the bell had gone because it was time to get up. So putting on my dressing gown and collecting my washing things and so on.
So it was in the night?
Yes, it was in the night.
Very dangerous.
Yes.
But there were no teachers there who began to spark your interest or imagination at all in that first school, in the preparatory school?
In an academic way, I would say not. I mean, I was always interested in history and found it kind of imaginative, it appealed to my imagination. But I remember from my later schooling having very good history teaching and enjoying history enormously, but that first school I don't really remember specific individuals as particularly charismatic teachers.
Were there any, apart from sports, do you have any hobbies or particular enthusiasms as a child up to your secondary school? You collect beetles or?
Well, I think I went through the kind of fairly standard range of hobbies. Stamps were a great thing, and I suppose I hadn't really thought of it. Stamp collecting may be somewhere at the origins of my interest in anthropology, because these exotic stamps from South Georgia and Cambodia and so on. I was always imaginatively drawn to kind of these distant, exotic places.
So, where did you go after your preparatory school? What was the next school?
I went to a conventional public school, which was called Sherborne,
Dorset.
in Dorset, which I have perhaps rather kind of jaundiced memories of, in that I remember the kind of alternatives for boys of my generation from that school were you go and be an army officer in Sandhurst, or you go onto the stock exchange, or you become a country solicitor. And there were very few who went. Few went to university. Going to university from that kind of school at that time basically meant going to Oxford or Cambridge. And if you couldn't get in, you might consider Trinity College Dublin, but they didn't send students to London or Reading.
A rather snobby school.
Yes, that's very much my memory of it. I may be doing it an injustice. But,
and you mentioned that there were teachers there who were beginning to enthuse you. And
yes.
Can you remember any of their names? Or
There was a man called Derek Jarrett, and there was a man called Graham Stevenson, both of whom taught history. And I remember them as the most charismatic teachers that I had, and particularly Graham Stevenson. At A-level I did a special paper on the unification of Italy, and that very much appealed to my imagination.
Well, this is all in the arts and humanities side. Did you do any science? Or?
I left it after A-level and was never good at it. But as I say, I think I had a very academically undistinguished school career. Just about good enough to just about scrape into Cambridge.
Well, before that, other things at that school, had you developed beyond stamp collecting to anything else, or was it mainly games? For instance, music or drama or politics? Were any of these things of interest at school?
Politics was always an interest, and I was kind of interested in CMD.
Even at Chevron?
Yes. That was, it was partly a sort of posturing rebelliousness, if you like, it was a very, very deeply conservative institution at that stage.
And
so there was a sort of group of us who were, kind of vaguely into the Labour Party and CMD.
And somewhat disapproved of by the local authorities. Or the
Yes, yes.
Some point I always ask about religion, and it sometimes comes up later, but since a lot of your work has been in India and on the aspects of religion, were you particularly, and often one goes through that great sort of questioning of one's religious upbringing towards the end of one's schooling, How were you brought up? As an Anglican, or?
I was brought up as an Anglican. I don't think my mother had the idea that it would be nice to go to church, but it was the Tory party of prayer kind of church, and I don't think she was very serious about it, though when she lived in Italy she flirted with Catholicism. And I remember as about an 8 or 9-year-old, I became a religious enthusiast for 6 months or something. But I was actually confirmed in the Church of England, but the whole of the football team was confirmed that year, and have basically, anyway, since the age of about 15 or 16, been an agnostic, and in later years I converted from being an agnostic into being a somewhat dogmatic atheist.
Did you? Oh, when did that happen?
I think that my personal attitudes to religion actually were hardened by doing the Benares study.
Oh. Should we deal with it when we come to the Benares study?
Yes.
And keep it on hold, but
sure.
That would be very interesting. And what about any sort of artistic or aesthetic side, like music or painting or anything like that?
Well, I was always much, my inclinations were always much more literary than, so I was always interested in writing and the mechanics of writing, and I dabbled briefly with trying to write poetry and so on.
And on the mechanics of writing, which interests me too, and again we could deal with it later, but do you, and you've written a lot and very elegantly, do you have any advice to people who write anthropology? What have you learnt?
What would my advice be?
What have you learnt from?
Probably I should ask you at this stage to switch the camera off. No, I would say to young anthropologists, don't read anthropologists to learn how to write, on the whole. There are some very good ones, I think.
Who would you pick out?
Evans Pritchard, Godfrey Leonhardt, Andre Bataille, I think all wrote well. Edmund Leach wrote in a very direct and sort of forceful, somewhat angular way. But I would tell people still to do in a way what got me into anthropology and read Bertrand Russell. Some of Bertrand Russell's essays I think he wrote with extraordinarily admirable clarity. George Orwell would be another excellent model.
How do you actually write? Technically, do you write on a computer, or have you always written on a typewriter? Do you write by hand?
At the moment, since computers came in, I write by hand, I put it on the computer, I print it out, I rewrite by hand on the next draft, and I go on until I've got it in a shape that I think it's more or less comprehensible and acceptable.
And you do that with all levels of things, even if you're writing a short review or an article, you write it by hand?
Yes.
Why do you do that?
I like to have paper in front of me and to be able to kind of go over the text and see that the sentences flow, and I just find it kind of much easier to kind of pick out the balance of sentences with the paper in front of me. Why do I do it? I'm an old fogey, I guess is the answer.
No, I don't think so. Many people do, and I certainly do the same thing. How many drafts do you characteristically do of something you're writing? You correct it and then you type it in again, and then... Or
it's very, it depends on how pressed I am, and also it depends a lot on the stage I'm at with an article or a chapter or whatever it is. At the beginning, it's many. I mean, it may be 5 or 10, and then the thing has sort of taken some shape, and I know more where I'm going and how I phrase things before, and so on. It goes much faster as I get to the end. So I might just do a couple towards the end, the final sections.
Well, let's return to your career. You say you just did well enough to scrape into Cambridge. Why did you choose Cambridge, or was it just a random?
My father had been here, as I explained, from that school at that time. You more or less went to Oxford or Cambridge, or you went to Sandhurst, So I did a series of entrance exams. I think I did one at Oxford and I did one here. And,
Which college do you come to?
King's.
I mean, some of my questions I know the answers, but I'm asking for the general public. Stephen Hugh Jones, who I interviewed, gave me a nice account of his entry interview and so on. Do you remember you came up presumably and talked to people here, do you?
Yes, that's right. I had an entrance exam and interviews. And
who interviewed you? Do you remember?
I know that Edmund Leach interviewed me because I'd expressed some marginal interest in possibly doing anthropology. And I think the senior tutor at Cargill, a lawyer.
Oh.
Cargill Jones, was it?
Do you remember your first encounter with Edmund at all? Or later on he was to have a big influence on you?
Later on he was to, I mean, I had no idea that this was such a kind of distinguished man. And so I came as a first year undergraduate.
To do Arcananth.
And this was an absolute revelation, being taught by Edmund from a first week undergraduate. And what I remember is the sort of incredibly meticulous comments that you would get on essays, and how we would sit in a room identical to this,
next door, perhaps.
next door, and he would pick books off his shelf and just say, go away and read those, you might find this interesting, or write about this, here's some books.
Would you say he was a good undergraduate teacher?
Brilliant. Very charismatic. I mean, I didn't realise that, the commitment of time and effort that he must have put into writing comments on essays and giving us circulars. He used to produce these sort of sheets explaining what is complementary filiation, or he was absolutely terrifically good.
I mean, did you ever find him uneven? Stephen tells stories of asking his secretary how the weather was. Was it stormy today? Implying, sometimes he was less even-tempered, but you always find him equable and reasonable in your supervisions.
As an undergraduate, yes. He was absolutely brilliant as an undergraduate supervisor, and he was incredibly helpful. And when I was writing up my PhD, the period in between, my first year in preparation for field work, I think he more or less let us sort of sink or swim. And I remember just before I went off to the field, there were these other kind of senior graduate students who'd all come back from field work. This was sort of Maurice Bloch and the Strathurns and Jim Farris and can't remember, lots of them. And Adam Cooper, very impressive bunch. And they'd organised a seminar, and Carrie Humphrey and I, who were kind of, the beginners, we used to go along, and I gave a paper in one of these seminars, which was a critique of Edmund's argument in animal categories and verbal abuse. And I showed it to Edmund, and he was absolutely infuriated by it. And didn't kind of talk to me for some time. And then I came back from the field, and the very first thing that I wrote was a critique of Edmund's introduction to aspects of caste, and I kind of wrote this out. After some time I'd been back, Edmund said to me, you must show me something. What is it you're writing? So I with great kind of trepidation, I gave him this thing, and I got the most wonderful comments back. He said, the only problem, this is terrific, the only problem with it is that you spend far too long trying to demolish Edmund Leach, which everybody knows is rubbish anyway.
Oh, nice. You mentioned there a number of your contemporaries. As an undergraduate, who that we might know your contemporaries carry was your...
Yes, I think there were 4 or 5 of us who went on from kind of my year as an undergraduate. There was Carrie and Carrie Humphrey and Jane Brownlee, as was. It became Jane Bunag, who did fieldwork in Thailand, married a Thai, and subsequently moved out of anthropology. There was Enid Shilkraut, who did fieldwork in Ghana, myself, and then there was Keith Hart.
Oh, yes.
Keith had done classics, so he was actually technically a year above us, but then moved into anthropology. I didn't, in fact, really know Keith personally well, anyway, until later.
Who were the other teachers at that time? There was Edmund.
There was Edmund. There was Tambaya came when we were undergraduates, and that was very important. I remember. I think he was sort of young, and I think originally he was on a temporary contract here. And he didn't know a lot of people in Cambridge, so he was prepared to kind of go out and have drinks with the third-year undergraduates. And he was an incredibly good lecturer. It struck us, and all the girls thought that he was amazingly sexy.
And this is the period when the myths tell us the staff and the students, maybe not the higher ones, were much closer together, that you used to go out to the bun shop or wherever it was and meet socially quite a lot with. So the hierarchy was much less visible. Is that a true picture of it, or the gap between, say, PhD students and undergraduates, and even with members of staff, was much smaller than it became later with larger numbers?
I think it doesn't entirely ring true to me. I mean, what I remember is, is having quite easy and informal contacts with Tandy, and also Edmund was always very friendly, and you could go for a drink with Edmund. But I don't remember that I ever got to know R40s or Jack Goody until I became a graduate student, and then there was the Friday seminar, and people would have a beer afterwards, and it became much more informal.
I mean, against, I'm not sure whether it was Stephen, someone, I think it was Alfie Gell actually, not in an interview, said that the rivalry between Forties and Leach was so strong that students at that time were dissuaded. If they were a follower of one, they were dissuaded. So Alfie, or whoever it was, didn't go to Jack's lectures because he was thought to be on the side of the devil. And
yes.
Was that true of your time?
Yes, very much true. I mean, I think Alfie has described this extremely engagingly. In an interview he gave, there's an introduction in the collection of his essays that Eric Hirsch put together after his death, and he describes this extremely well. You know, that Edmund was Levi-Strauss's vicar on earth, and Jack Goody was the sidekick to Satan, and so on. And I think that's very much the way in which, but it was sort of exciting, you know, in the sort of sense that there was our team and their team, you know, and
what were these people like as lecturers? I mean, was Edmund a good lecturer as well as a good undergraduate teacher?
Yes, I thought that Edmund was a good lecturer. I mean, I think the good lecturers, when I was an undergraduate, were Edmund and Tamby, and also within the anthropology department, I actually found Ray Abraham's lectures were the kind of lectures that you could go to and understand what was being said and take notes in. But actually, I really didn't go to very many lectures at all when I was a student here, though I did take studying anthropology seriously. I mean, how I spent my time was Edmund would give me these books and I would go away and read them, and seldom went to lectures.
One thing I sort of missed out was why you came to do anthropology at all, because it was rather an unknown subject, and to come from Sherborne to read Arcanant. Why was it that you chose Arcanant? Do you remember?
Yes, I think I do. I mean, I think there were a number of kind of inputs. One input was that, as I said earlier, I'd been very struck by reading these Bertrand Russell essays, and there's one collection of them called Marriage and Morals, which, if I recall rightly, the first essay starts out with Malinowski and the Trobriands, and the families aren't God-given in form of middle-class England, and this struck me as such an amazing thought, So that was something. So Bertrand Russell was a serious influence. As a sort of late-ish teenager, I'd been given a good deal of freedom to kind of go off by myself during summers, and I'd been a bit in Turkey, and I'd gone hitchhiking in Morocco.
On your own?
Yeah. And so I'd come across Westermarck.
Oh yes, Edward Westermarck.
So that was, so it struck me as being a kind of, I'd heard of it, it sounded terribly exotic, I really didn't know anything seriously about it, but the idea appealed to me. And then I think there was a straightforward, pragmatic calculation that King's history, all these amazingly well-read competitor students, and that I had a better chance of getting in to do anthropology than to do history.
What was King's like in those days? I mean, can you give any straws in the wind of what this college was like? We're talking about 65, was it? Or
no, I
62?
finished in 65. So
62?
Yeah, so I must have come up in 62.
Yeah.
It was nice, in the sense that
it was proper salmon at that time, right?
That's right, yeah. It had a reputation of being very much more liberal than a lot of colleges, and that was sort of very much kind of valued. So it had a kind of nice, relatively relaxed. I'm hesitating here because I think certainly I did, and I think probably a lot of my contemporaries did, or wondered how we'd got in. So it wasn't entirely relaxed, but I made some good friends quite quickly, and very much appreciated King's and appreciated the was more liberal.
And did you get involved in all those peripheral activities that undergraduates find compete with their work, acting or rowing or music or what?
No, I think anthropology really kind of took me over, anthropology and girlfriends. But above all anthropology, and I spent, I did, it was the first time really I had sort of seriously engaged with intellectual activity and kind of begun to understand what it was about, and I got obsessed by it.
What was it about? I mean, what is it about anthropology that really gripped you? It sounds from the marriage thing that you come from a broken marriage, you've taken your own culture for granted, and then you suddenly realised the relativism of your own world, and you start exploring other worlds. Was it that, or was it?
Yes, I think it was that, and I think that, one of the things that has always appealed to me about it was the idea that here is a sort of a discipline that in many ways is into relativizing and questioning the assumption of other social science disciplines. And though I wouldn't have formulated it in this way at that stage, there is something about the democracy of anthropology that is ordinary. It's the whole lives of ordinary punters that anthropologists are sort of interested in, and that it's difficult to think of other disciplines except perhaps history that doesn't have live informants on the whole, that has that attraction.
It's dealing with ordinary people.
Yes.
Let's move on to, you presumably did quite well in your tripos. You got high marks if you worked very hard and so on. Did you get a first, or?
Yes, I did well I did disastrously in my first year because I completely ignored archaeology and physical anthropology, which I'm afraid I was a terrible student at, unconscientious and so on. But in the second and third years I got firsts. Yeah.
And you won a state studentship or something to go on?
Yes, yeah.
How was it that, did you straight away choose to work in India, or did you have other places you would have liked to, or were your first choice? How did you choose to do your PhD in India?
I'm afraid this is a totally discreditable story. I had to fill in the forms when I was preparing for my final exams, and I asked sort of Edmund, what am I going to do, And he sort of said, well, why don't you go to India? Which quite appealed to me. I did know that I did not want to work in Africa. I did intuitively, in some instinctive way, I wanted to work in a society with a kind of a rich recorded history and a sort of encrusted ancient culture. So, as we were talking about at lunch, I've always been attracted to the possibility of working in Southeast Asia or Japan at one stage appealed to me. But it was sort of, really, I picked India because I needed to pick something very quickly in order to get on with revision.
And you just wrote down the word India, you didn't say south, north, east, west, or?
No. I originally said that I wanted to work on polyandry in an area of the UP Hills called Jonsarbawa. And that indeed is what I thought I was going to do until I actually went to India.
And had you, even as an undergraduate, imagined you might be supervised by Edmund, or was that a later decision? And you didn't choose India because you thought, well, it'd be nice to go on with Edmund, or?
Yes, I think that was very much part of it. But if I was going to kind of stay on and do a PhD, I wanted to work with Edmund. I really didn't know very much about other university departments and who I might have worked with. And as I said, Edmund was an amazingly charismatic teacher, so I just assumed that I found the best by chance anyway, and that this was the thing to do.
And you mentioned that once you started on what was vaguely called the pre-field work training period,
Yes.
he more or less left you to your devices. Was there, the accounts that I've had from others, was that wasn't taken, there wasn't much formal instruction during that period? You read and learnt languages and things?
Yes, yeah, we were very much left to our own devices, and so I read a lot about India. I remember there was a seminar on councils that Audrey Richards ran with Adam Cooper.
It was published as a volume, wasn't it?
Yeah, that I used to kind of participate in that, but more or less there was no guidance or training. I think we were given advice we might read Laura Bahama's book on doing field work, which, as I remember, had something about the usefulness of tennis shoes, which
The water came out of the bag.
Yes.
Famous advice. Did you get to know Audrey at all? What was she like, Audrey Richards?
Yes, as an undergraduate I'd been to seminars that she ran, and this council's seminar. I never knew her terribly well, but I mean, she was sort of warm and friendly, I remember, yes.
You presumably did, what, 6 or 9 months, 6 months before you went out to the field, or how long did you spend in preparation?
From October, which shows my extraordinary naivety, till June, and I went
Yes,
to,
I've been saying.
went to India
In the middle of the monsoon.
well, during still the hot season, the end of the hot season, by boat from Marseille. I'd seen Shakespeare Waller and thought that was still the way you got to it.
Naive in two senses, going then and going by that transport mechanism. Can you remember arriving in India, your first encounter with India?
Yes, landed at Bombay and was sort of really hit by Bombay. You know, the kind of crowds and the heat and so on. And then I took the train to Pune, where I met up with a fellow Cambridge graduate student who was a year before me, or 2 years before me, Tony Carter. And Tony was, you know, very important in my association with India. But Tony introduced me to Village India, and he then took me off for a few days, a week or something, to stay in the village where he was doing field work, and took me around while he was doing it. And you know, this was an amazing kind of confidence boost, because you know, it was the first experience. You really can eat yogurt with your hands. So the sort of practicalities of how one might live in the field, I was sort of exposed to more or less immediately I arrived. And that was terribly important in giving a kind of confidence boost. Yes, I can cope with this, you know.
But you didn't stay in Pune, you...
No, I then went in the summer heat without any train reservations at all in a third class carriage to Delhi, and arrived there.
A wet rag.
After, 36 hours or something, and then stayed in a small hotel and reported to M.N. Srinivas in the Department of Sociology at the Delhi School of Economics. Edmund, during the preparatory year, André Bataille who was then a Simon Fellow in Manchester, had come down to meet Edmund, and I think he'd had lunch with Edmund, and then Edmund was busy, and I'd been detailed off to kind of show Andre around for an hour or two. Anyway, Edmund then twisted Andre's arm to become my kind of supervisor while I was doing fieldwork in India. And that led to a very important academic and personal relationship.
Let's just take those two people, because they're among the most eminent Indian anthropologists, sociologists. Srinivas, how did you find him? What sort of person was he?
I never got to know him particularly well. Extremely gracious and kind of helpful and good-humoured, but a little bit sort of distant. He was a 22-year-old undergraduate, and he was this very distinguished man. So but helpful.
Had you read any of his work by then?
Yes, I'd read collections of his essays and the Korb monograph and so on.
And it's very difficult to summarise such a long and deep relationship as that with Andre, but I mean, he was your local supervisor, and you remained a friend.
Yes.
Ever since.
Yeah.
How would you describe? We both know Andre quite well, but how would you describe Andre in your relationship?
How would I describe? That's a fairly tall.
Yes, it is. Any anecdote?
Lots of anecdotes, but I mean, I think the first thing that I would say about Andre is that he's a man of almost sort of frightening honesty and integrity. I mean, there is absolutely no bullshit, you know. Extraordinarily bright, quite reserved. I mean, it takes quite a long time to really get to know him. Very kind of loyal to his kind of friends. And I think, somebody, I would say, really one of the most, if not the most distinguished Indian social scientist of his generation.
Over the whole world, or in India?
Over the whole world.
Over the whole world.
Of Indian social scientists.
Oh, I see, Indian social scientists,
yes. I mean, I was thinking of diaspora Indians as well.
Yeah.
Yes.
So along with Desai and on,
Yeah.
I've always wondered, I mean, I've always liked his work and been deeply influenced by it, but I've always wondered whether this dual ancestry that he has, I mean, Ombre, Bataille, the French Indian, and living with these two inheritances, the ways in which that must have influenced his interest in caste and class, which is what he's mainly worked on. Did you notice that at all in anything of that in knowing him?
I have always personally thought of Andre much more as a product of Calcutta and Bengal than I've thought of him as someone with a kind of dual ancestry. I mean, it is interesting that he has written about social inequality from so many different dimensions and so many aspects of it, but that one aspect of it that he has handled much less extensively than others is race. But as I say, I really think of Andre as a Bengali Bhadralok professor rather than a Frenchman in any sense at all.
Well, let's return to the fieldwork. Did you by this time know where you were going? I mean, you were in Delhi.
Yeah. one of the things, so I showed up in the Delhi School of Economics and went to see Srinivas, and Srinivas asked me where I was going, and I said John Salbois, and he said, why on earth? And he was absolutely right. I mean, D.M. Majumdar had written a book about this area, and Majumdar had been a professor in that now and had used this area as a kind of regular place where his students and young lecturers went to do bits of ethnographic research. Srinivas's line was, well, of all, you want to go to the hills, that's fine, but of all the places in the hills, why pick there? I mean, it's a sort of exotic, maverick kind of little area. At least, go around and look at some other possibilities. And this seemed sort of sensible advice. So I picked out kind of 3 areas that I would just sort of go around and look at. And I went to the first of them, Kangra, which is where I wound up doing field work, and thought, this is great. Why go any further? And that's how I wound up in Kangra.
Why was it great? What was great about it? Or describe your first impressions, if you can remember back to that.
I mean, this is this beautiful, lush valley with mountains on one side of it going up 16, 17,000 feet with snow and snow caps, and it was September, and it was very lush, and there was streams and brooks, and so physically it was extremely attractive, and then I found it very easy to meet a few people who were very encouraging and suggested particular villages and so on. And having kind of abandoned the idea of that I was going to work in this polyandrous area, another of the kind of seems very promiscuous. I mean, another of the interests I had at that stage was to work on local level politics, which was something that I'd been very impressed and influenced by Freddie Bailey's work, which I read in the preparatory year, and my friend Tony Carter was very interested also in sort of factional politics, which is what he was doing in Maharashtra. So I had sort of, my intention was that I would actually work on local level politics in Kangra, and I met some people and immediately, was told about some villages where, the political situation, political rivalries seemed very interesting, so forth. Though I never wound up writing about that at all.
So, sorry. Tell me something generally about the fieldwork. I mean, many, again, either advice to younger anthropologists or whatever. Many people find fieldwork a mixture of delight and misery and exhaustion and loneliness and exhilaration. I mean, how did you, on the whole, that first fieldwork, was it mainly pleasurable and mainly okay, or?
I think it was the most difficult fieldwork that I've done. I mean, I've done fieldwork in 2 other areas of India and subsequently, and I think I probably got to enjoy fieldwork more as I've got older, but I've always enjoyed it. I remember the first 3 months were somehow a terrific relief. I mean, I'd got a nice family that I was living with, and people seemed very friendly, and so on. The next bit of time I remember as terribly traumatic. There was a general election going on, and because I was interested in local politics, I was making quite a lot of inquiries about what was going on politically in this place, and people suddenly became rather suspicious, and you very rapidly reach a sort of plateau. I felt I was making no linguistic progress and so on. So I remember a kind of period between, say, 3 months and 6 months where I did find it very difficult. And then I got into a kind of routine and was much clearer about what I was doing, and got to enjoy it again.
Mm. How long was the
field work was, I was in India for 2.5 years, and I think I was in the field for about 26 months in the village.
By modern standards, where they're trying to rush them through in their 4 years?
Yes.
It's a long period, isn't it?
Yes.
That's been one of the changes in anthropology,
Yes.
that students now seem to do shorter, characteristically shorter field work.
Yes. And I think also that we were kind of sent off in a much more open-ended way. I mean, now the research proposals, X is going to work on, notions of personhood or whatever. I think I went to the field with very vague ideas. I'm going to go and see what's there,
Which do you think is the preferable, or given the present circumstances, there's probably no choice, but do you think that old-fashioned way, which was the same that I had, which was holistic, you studied everything and you found what was most interesting, do you think that's still viable, or?
I think it's still viable if people have enough time, but of course they don't. So I don't really see any alternative, but something much more directed. And I think that I was dead lucky. I mean, in this sense, that I wound up writing about kind of caste and kinship. And, I hardly knew of Louis Dumont's work when I went to the field, and hadn't in fact read. I think it was published in French first in 1966, which is when I was beginning my field work. I think that's right. But Andre had been reading Dumont and would ask me questions, and talk to me when I went to Delhi about Dumont's work. So somehow I was collecting data relevant to sort of Dumontian questions without actually ever having properly read Dumont. So there was a sort of, a kind of steer that I was getting.
I mean, Andre's been always fairly ambivalent about Dumont's work. What is your, one's view of him changes from day to day, but he's a major overshadowing figure on the subjects which you work on.
Yes.
Did you know him at all?
I met him a few times, but I wouldn't say that I must have met him 3 or 4 times. I wouldn't say that we had a personal relationship in the way that I had with Andre or with Edmund.
But as a thinker, how do you now esteem him anyway?
Very highly, though he's become an increasingly unfashionable kind of figure. I remain in many ways quite committed to the sort of Dumontian legacy. I think any Indianist of my generation basically has had their career and a lot of their intellectual agenda set by Dumont. I think that he has been very unfairly criticised, and is actually right where it's conventional now to say that he's wrong, and vice versa. The bits of Dumont, like the sort of theory about substantialization of caste, which is still trotted out, I feel is deeply problematic. But yes, I think that an immensely powerful figure who represented for people of my generation, this sort of very exciting possibility of being able to bring together the very kind of diverse studies that have been done in India and make sense of them according to a small set of unifying principles. There was a sort of real excitement in this, of being able to relate what Bailey was saying about Orissa to, you know, something that was going on in Tamil Nadu, and to see, you know, variations on a theme that all made sense in terms of, you know, these structuring principles.
Your first fieldwork led to a PhD and a book. Can you kind of summarise briefly what the problem was and what your answer to the problem was in that first work, Caste and Kinship in Kangra?
Well, essentially what it was an attempt to kind of take off from Dumont to demonstrate the pervasiveness of the principle of hierarchy, and how hierarchical relations are not just a matter of relations between caste, but penetrate within castes, so that they kind of order the texture of human social relationships from a very micro level to within the family, to relations within and between clans and marriage circles and so forth, and how the language of hierarchy is used to describe many other forms of social relationships, including kind of landlord-tenant relationships and so on. And yet, at the same time, there is a sort of a countervailing, but in the particular case I described, ideas about equality that are rooted in notions of brotherhood, and how this social system works out. That would be one aspect of it. Perhaps the most important and interesting ethnographic bit was about marriage, and particularly about systems of unequal marriage, hypogamous marriages, and how there are internal contradictions within the system that are continually threatening it with downfall, which indeed downfall does happen. Marriage circles are reorganized into egalitarian brotherhoods, and how these in turn generate contradictions. So it's very much, as I can tell by the smile on your face, you're recognizing political systems of Happy Burma and Gumsa and Gumlao. And it was, you know, it was very much influenced by that, but it was also deeply influenced by reading of Levi-Strauss's Elementary Structures of Kinship.
Well, I was smiling because of that, but also by something which you perhaps won't like so much, which was the curious parallel between the beginning of our interview and where we've got to now. I mean, anyone watching this interview would say, well, isn't he writing about his own childhood?
Yes, which was precisely why I mentioned the hypogamous marriage at the beginning. I am conscious of that. However, it's not the problem. I mean, this has happened to me more than once in my fieldwork. I think I got interested in this problem, perhaps, though I wasn't aware of it at the time, because of my own personal background. But it certainly wasn't the case that I decided to work in Kangra because I simply was too ignorant to know that I was going to come across this kind of marriage system.
Mm. But it's the double thing. It's your own parents' hypogamous marriage and a stress you laid on class and inequality in your own family tree and background.
Yes.
Which pervaded your childhood a lot, snobbery and childhood oppositions between different social strata. I mean, England is very, very class
I think
conscious.
that's exactly right. Mm. So it had some resonance with me, and perhaps that's why I wound up writing about it. But I have also to say that, I did, as I said earlier, I did a lot of work, empirical work on local level politics. And it was Andre who really discouraged me from pursuing that and writing about it. And he basically said, you just haven't got the kind of intellectual background to really write about this in a very good way. I've been influenced by Bart's game theory type of stuff, and Andre was a bit sniffy about this, and said, no, the stuff you're getting on kinship and marriage is actually much more important, and you're at Cambridge and they know about kinship and marriage at Cambridge, and you do that, and maybe later on come back to the serious stuff of politics.
Did you ever come back to it? Or no?
No. I've sometimes had fantasies about doing so, but I think Andre was dead right. I don't think that I was sufficiently well informed about the literature and what I could do with that data at that stage.
Was there ever any difficulty about having a local supervisor and having a supervisor back in England? I mean, you didn't get contrary advice between the two. I suppose you didn't hear much from Edmund.
No, I think I had one letter in the course of 2.5 years. A very friendly letter, and I'd written a little piece actually I did write something about politics for this Indian journal called Seminar, and I'd written a kind of report on the elections and so on. And I think one letter I had from Edmund was that I'd sent him this piece when it was published, and he wrote a nice short note saying, glad to see you're getting it in print. It was the time when Edmund was becoming Provost of Kings, and I'm sure he was fully preoccupied with more important matters.
When you came back, do you remember students often have reverse culture shock and difficulties when they come back to England, especially after such a long time? Did you have any of those difficulties when you came back, or was it a great relief or pleasure to be back?
No, I think it was quite difficult actually. I came back and I moved back to Cambridge, and I really didn't like it at all. I very much valued my experience as an undergraduate in Cambridge and got a lot out of it, but didn't like being back in Cambridge afterwards. I think it was partly because all my friends had moved on, my kind of cohort of people I got out of sync with. Parry had spent a lot of time trying to get permission to get into the Soviet Union and do her field work, so she was still doing field work. Keith's field work had been much shorter, so I didn't really know people terribly well, and in fact I went to live in London. And the other thing is that the period of fieldwork was over a kind of extraordinary hiatus in youth culture in Britain. I mean, 66, and I came back at the end of 1968, and kind of suddenly the world had changed, and kind of political landscape had changed very much, and it all felt quite alien.
But how was Edmund? I think you mentioned he was very helpful when you were writing up. I mean, he made a lot of comments.
Yeah.
But you didn't go to sort of writing up seminars because you were in London, or did you go to a few of those?
As I recall, there weren't writing up seminars at that stage. There was the regular Friday seminar, in which I remember I gave at least 2 papers.
That really was the writing up seminar in a way, wasn't it?
Yes, but it wasn't differentiated into a student seminar.
Yeah.
So, one week there might be a graduate student, and the next week there might be Clifford Geertz. Or
Do you remember anything about those seminars? Were they lively, exciting occasions, or bloodbaths?
No, I do remember something about them. I remember them in a way more before I went to the field, in that preparatory period as these sort of ritual jousts. But then I was attached, as I've said, as a student to the Delhi School of Economics, and somewhat to my arrogant British pride, I was sort of astounded by the fact that the Delhi School sociology seminar seemed to me to be better, more engaged, more articulate than the Cambridge seminars. I just assumed that Cambridge seminars were pretty damn good. You know? So I think after that I always looked at the Cambridge seminars with a more critical eye. And
Did you do any teaching at this stage? Were you beginning to do any supervising or anything either in London or in Cambridge while you were writing up? Or
while I was writing up, Tambaya was running the South Asia class, and he used to have a man called Roger Ballard, I think, and is it Roger? And we used to go along to all the classes, and it was a way of kind of Tambi sounding off recently returned fieldwork workers.
So we were associated with it?
Yes.
And the thesis wrote itself, or was it okay? I mean, you didn't struggle with it too much. How long did it take you to?
I think it took, I was quite slow. I think it took 2 years. And I found it agony.
Did you?
But sort of masochistically satisfying agony.
Agony because it just didn't come out right, and writing is very tiring. And
yes, writing is difficult. I had a lot of data. I just do think, I mean, maybe you're somebody who, like Alfred Joel, used to just perfectly formed, elegant sentences apparently came out. I have to struggle.
Who were your examiners?
Ma Forters and David Perko.
Were they okay?
Yes, they were absolutely fine and kind of very complimentary. I remember the Viva, during which I was rather nervous, was a slightly trying experience because Maya sometimes used to speak in the way that he would write, long sentences with many parentheses and so on. And there were periods in the Viva, I remember, where David would intervene and say, I think what Professor Fortes means to say is...
After that, I mean, what happened? Did you get a job straight away, or?
I had a job already. In fact, I mean, I think the truth is that the only reason that I actually finished and handed in the thesis was that I'd had an interview at Edinburgh, and they had said, well, your thesis will be in by the time you start here, won't it? And I actually kind of naively took this literally and thought that it had to be. So I submitted it, I think, on the day before I went up to Edinburgh and started teaching.
When was that? About 70?
Yeah, 70, I think, at the end of 70. Yeah.
How long were you at Edinburgh?
3 years.
Was that a good experience?
It was very pleasant. I liked the city of Edinburgh very much. I had a boss that I very much enjoyed. And
Little John, was it? Or?
Yeah, Jimmy Littlejohn. The department was at that stage not in very good shape. And I was actually quite glad to get out of it. Not because it was unpleasant, but because I felt that I would never actually do anything if I stayed there. And I moved to the LSE where the culture was, you do right things, and
So you went to the LSE in '74 or something?
Yes, 74.
Describe the LSE what the LSE was like when you arrived. I mean, it was the time, well, Morris was obviously there.
Morris was there. It was headed at the time by Julian Pitt Rivers and Johan Lewis. There was Jean LaFontaine, there was James Woodburn, Stephen Morris was still around. Jose Cotillero, I think, had just left.
Peter Loisos hadn't come.
Peter was there. So Peter was a kind of colleague and friend from the start. Joanna Overing had joined the same year as I did.
Alfie wasn't there?
No, Alfie came later, several years later.
And Chris wasn't there?
Chris wasn't there either.
I mean, it's a difficult thing to talk about one's own department, but the LSE, I knew it just a bit before you were there,
Yes.
and a few years before, and it was even elder guard, and it was Raymond Firth and Shapiro and people like that.
Yes.
And it had already changed, but it still had Stephen Morris and James and others there. I don't know whether you want to talk about the LSE department later, because it was obviously quite, the reputation outside was that it was very riven into several factions and oppositions.
Yeah, I'm quite happy to talk about it, but I mean that's not how I actually
Perceived
kind
it.
of perceived it. I mean, I perceived it as, I feel I've been very fortunate, and I perceived it as, there were intellectual tensions and some personal tensions, but, on the whole, people talked to each other. I thought it was a very engaged intellectual atmosphere. So that's not how David McKnight was there. So, there were people who worked together more than other people. And, so I can see that, there was a degree of apparent exclusiveness, but I didn't actually experience it.
Well, you're a nice person, Johnny. no one could take exception to you, but I mean, the famous, as you know, the famous kind of tensions between Eoin and Morris.
Yes. No, that was certainly there. But when I first went, there was it was more. Morris was very junior still, and it was more, Morris being a kind of iconoclast. I mean, I remember an early staff meeting where the convener said, "This is what we're going to do," and Morris bursting out, "Conveners are just like postmen, they do what we say," something to this effect, and which no doubt deeply got up the noses of Johan and Julian. Though Julian, I think, was altogether too patrician to really get seriously upset by it, but there was a sort of jokiness about it at that stage, anyway.
And you obviously taught a lot and supervised a lot. Do you enjoy, or do you enjoy lecturing and undergraduate supervisions and seminars?
I think what I enjoy most is undergraduate supervisions. I get quite a lot out. I put quite a lot into it, and I get quite a lot out of giving lectures. But I do spend a lot of time preparing them, or have done over the years. Graduate supervision and PhD students, I think that the truth is that I've actually got to enjoy it more over the years, perhaps as I felt I had more time or felt more confident or whatever. But, and I think, at the LSE, for a number of years, almost all graduate students have had two supervisors, and those who've worked in South Asia have tended to work with Chris Fuller and myself, and we've made a relatively harmonious team, and I think it's worked quite well, and particularly over more recent years.
How many PhD students have you had roughly? Do you know?
I think it's something between 35 and 40. I'm not quite sure over there.
And also presumably a number of taught masters
Yes.
students
Yes.
who do dissertation.
Yes. Yes.
And what about administration? Did you like that, or did you do much of that? Or
Yeah, I did all the kind of routine graduate admissions and so on. I think I did 4 years altogether as the convener, which I did actually not like. And I not liked it for slightly different reasons than one often hears. I actually found my departmental colleagues were on the whole extremely supportive and nice, and that was all fine, but I just hated dealing with the LSE bureaucracy.
it used to be quite a top-down and
Yes.
intrusive bureaucracy.
The first 3 years I had as convener, we had an RE, we had a HEFKE inspection, we had some other kind of report, evaluation, and I found this really a
Wearing.
terrible nervous strain. And as the convener, you kind of feel responsible, And,
When was this? In the
no,
90s?
it would have been in the 90s, yes.
Yeah.
And it was a time where departments were becoming cost centres and, you ran your own budgets and so on.
At what point did you get married?
Uh,
Was it when you came back from, when you
Yes.
had a job, or?
Margaret and I were living together when I was writing up my PhD thesis, and then we got married shortly after I'd taken up the Edinburgh job. She moved out to Edinburgh with me, and we got married, I think, at the Easter that year, in my first year of teaching.
She's a filmmaker.
Yes, that's right.
Tell me something about what kind of films does she make? Anthropological type films, or?
No, she's a documentary filmmaker, and I think she's made films on a number of different kinds of issues. One kind of drama documentary, and she did a series on public transport for Channel 4. I think the best way of describing it would be that they're all in some way kind of politically engaged documentary. My latest field work has been in industrial central India, and because of the stage at which the children were at that stage, I did that field work to start with alone, but like you going back every year to Nepal, I've been going back every year to this place Bilai, and Margaret set up an access training program for teaching documentary film to 12 local kids who wouldn't normally get a look in media in India. So she's developed very much an interest in that place and an independent circle of social contacts there and so on.
Well, we'll come back to Balai in a moment, but in between you, I don't know whether you went back to Kangra or whether you then, your next big fieldwork project was Benares. Was there, how did you shift, and at what point did you shift?
I shifted, I think I started the Benares fieldwork in '76.
Yeah.
I went back in, I think it was '74, very briefly to Kangra.
Yeah.
But the main purpose of that trip was to kind of suss out the possibilities of the next lot of fieldwork, which was the Benares fieldwork. And how it came about that I shifted. I mean, I've done this twice. I kind of really felt that if I went on, I'd sort of written up what I wanted to say about Congo, and I felt, it's time to do something different. And that if I went on working in Congo, even though if I had gone back to political interests or whatever, that somehow I would just spend the rest of my time either discovering that I was wrong or trying to justify how I was right. So I sort of made a fairly clean break and went to work in Benares.
When was that? When did you go there?
I went there first in 70s. Well, I went to look at it and kind of work out the possibilities, I think, in 74. And I started the field work in 76. And I went on working in Benares. I mean, I think I had 15 months to start with, and then I kept going back till the middle of the 80s.
Can you describe what that fieldwork was about, and what was the central theme and your
The
experience?
Benares fieldwork.
Yes.
It was a study of death, and it was a study of Benares is a major kind of centre of the sort of death industry. People go there to die, they go there to cremate corpses, they go there to immerse the ashes of corpses cremated outside. And it was a study of the various caste groups of mortuary specialists, and so it was a study of kind of death as a living. And it was also a study of collective representations of death and of mortuary rituals. So the book that resulted was predictably called Death in Benares, but it tried to handle these two aspects. I mean, death as a social organisation and as a business enterprise, if you like, and death in its symbolic and conceptual framework.
And how was it that studying death turned you from an agnostic into an atheist?
I found the Benares fieldwork incredibly interesting and very kind of challenging. But I found a number of the ideas that I discerned as underlying a lot of what people were saying and were going on about. I mean, really rather deeply disturbing and frankly, personally unpleasant. I mean, you'd meet old men who the priests would be telling, their son had died in some tragic circumstances, and the priests would be droning on about bad death and the fruits of karma and so on. And I found this personally unattractive.
I mean, Edmund was always often very angry about particularly monotheistic religions of the West and their ideas of concepts of damnation and so on and so on.
Yes.
You shared that later on, a revulsion, sense of revulsion, is that right? I mean, not shared in the sense that you took it from Edmund, but you have a similar feeling. I mean, was your dislike of all religions, or just the two main ones you'd encountered, Christianity and Hinduism?
Well, it was obviously based on the two main ones that I'd encountered, but I guess I'm, anyway, as my story of how I came to be confirmed as an Anglican would suggest, I'm religiously unmusical, so there's a certain sort of innate predisposition to skepticism. Sort of rationalist thought, if you like.
And you did quite a lot of work on the idea of gifts and debts.
Yes.
In that fieldwork, particularly, didn't you?
Yes, that's right.
What was that work about? What was the theme of that?
Well, it was sparked off by by some fairly dramatic and to me extremely interesting ethnography about the remuneration of these priests, which is conceptualized as a religious gift, and it's not conceptualized as a payment. And these gifts are held to embody the sins of the donor and to do terrible things to the recipient unless they pass them on, which they can't afford to because that's their living. So they're caught in this terrible double bind. So it started out with this ethnography, and this to me extremely interesting and rather kind of touching personal situation of these mortuary specialists, but not only mortuary specialists in Benares. I mean, these gifts are given to pilgrimage priests and so on. And that took me back to relooking at Marcel Maus's classic essay and to more general considerations of the anthropological literature on reciprocity and so forth. And I think that I would immodestly claim that one of the spin-offs of this was a rereading of Maus's essay that was not quite conventional at the time. It put Maus's essay much more in terms of sort of his evolutionary thought about his thought about the evolution of society and the evolution of forms of exchange.
And it also led into, among other things, into the book you edited with Maurice Bloch on
Yes.
morality of money. And
Yes.
tell us about how that book, which has been very influential, occurred.
Well, we'd done an earlier book called Death and the Regeneration of Life. And I think actually it was me who suggested that we do a kind of repeat performance. And these were based on London University intercollegiate seminars, and each of them had about 8 or 10 essays. And I mean, I now think that their main significance probably was actually that they were sort of branding for LSE anthropology, that it brought large numbers of the contributors were either from the LSE or had been associated, and it got people, talking together and putting together their ideas on a certain theme. And I think that it gave, for a time anyway, a certain sort of profile to LSE anthropology that, was relatively significant and meant that, it was sort of it had an identifiable, and fairly coherent conception of where anthropology was going. I mean, the two, as I've said, the two books were preceded by fairly lengthy introductions that Maurice and I wrote, which tried to pull the essays together and say something more general with greater or lesser success. But somewhat to my surprise, actually, I mean, the Money and Morality book was, is still around.
Yes.
People are still citing it and reading it.
My students certainly are. It's always difficult to co-edit a book with someone else, and Maurice is a lively mind. Have you always found it quite easy to work with Maurice? Or?
Yes, I haven't found it terribly difficult. I mean, there's no question of sitting in the same room and going over a draft with Maurice. I mean, I need to sit down completely independently, take the text we're working on and try and write it by myself and then give it to him, and he crosses it all out. And so on. But no, I don't remember any kind of occasions where we kind of fell out or it seemed particularly difficult. I mean, I think I remember one or two occasions where he just told me that paragraph that I'd spent the last day crafting was rubbish. But I don't remember it as difficult at all.
I mean, we won't go over too many of your other colleagues, but Alfie Gell, I never had a chance to interview, though I've written about him.
Yes.
What was Alfie like as a colleague?
Alfie was, he was lovely, actually. He was a wonderful seminar participant. He was just so clever, so quick, and you'd sit in a seminar, and Alfred would he would be drawing all the time. He'd come up with kind of wonderful portraits of James Woodburn and James Woodburn's beard, great kind of tangles and so on. You think, is this guy? He hasn't been listening to a word. And then the paper giver would end, and he would come up with some long, very incisive comment and so on. Terrific. I never worked with Alfred in the way that I've worked with, say, Morris or Chris Fuller, but I always very much enjoyed him as a colleague. He was very much a kind of lone individualist, Alfie.
Let's go on to your third piece of fieldwork, which was again very different from your second. How did that come about, and when did it come about?
Right.
Belai.
I tend not to finish things until I kind of somehow have to. I mean, it's like the
PhD.
Like the PhD. So I kind of needed to commit myself to a new project. Again, like Kangra, I really wanted to kind of shift of scene. Andre, who has been a big influence, has for years been going on at me, kind of, you really ought to take modern India more seriously. And this was, of course, always one of Andre's big problems with Louis Dumont. So I was sort of sympathetic to the idea of doing something on industry. There were two very important influences on that. So this was essentially a study of steel workers in a big Soviet-built steel plant constructed on a greenfield site in central India. I wanted to do something on industry partly as a big break, partly because we had, Alfred had a PhD student, Chris Pinney, and Alfred was ill at some stage, and I was involved in Chris Pinney's supervision. And Chris Pinney had been doing a study in a company town in Madhya Pradesh, and had got sort of heavily into E.P. Thompson and so on. And Chris was an influence. I kind of felt, that's really interesting. But an equally big influence was Michael Tausig's book, The Devil and Commodity Fetishism in South America, where I was just terribly intrigued by his decoding of the stories of the baptism of banknotes and the devil contracts and so on, as a sort of proto-Marxian commentaries on alienation and commodity fetishism and so on. And I kind of felt that this was terribly fertile, but that Tausig's ethnography was not always of the richest and most detailed kind, and that this, opened up a whole field that I would kind of like to get into. So I decided that I wanted to do something on factory labour in India for those reasons. And I went in '92, I think, just to look around. And it was actually Alfie Joel who suggested that I might look at Vilai. I went to various places, but Alfred, who'd done work in just south, Adivasi, in a tribal area to the south of there, had been through Vilai. I think he'd once spent a night in a Russian hotel there or something, and he said, it looks really interesting. And I went there, and I just went there for a day, and I thought, I can really imagine making something of this. So that's how I wound up there.
And what interested you, and what was the theme of the study? Not everything at this point, or was it everything? You went with the usual open-minded.
I'm afraid, disgracefully, in a way, the answer is yes. I mean, the real question in my mind was a very kind of non-academic question. If you were somebody of my age and you'd been a peasant in one of these small villages, you would have lived through an industrial revolution in the course of your lifetime. And how would your world have changed? How would you think about those changes? What in fact would have happened to caste relations, kinship relations that was very different from the way that your parents had grown up or whatever? And that essentially is still the set of questions. I mean, it's terribly broad, but the set of questions with which I've remained. And it's gone on proliferating, because I started out and I was mainly working with workers actually in the steel plant, who are a sort of aristocracy of labour, and then I realised, well, there's the public sector factory, and I think there are very big differences with people working in the private sector in all sorts of ways. So I felt I needed to, do some work in private sector factories, and then I felt I needed to look at the bottom of the heap, informal sector, unorganised sector labour. So it's gone on expanding.
And it's continuing now.
It's continuing, but I feel that I've got to an age where I've got to draw it to a close, and actually I've written quite a number of articles about it. There's still other things that I want to write about in article form, but I really want to get it together as a sort of the big picture in book form now, in monograph form.
And will that be precipitated by deciding on the next project, which will force you to finish this project, or have you got another field work?
I'm afraid that my stage of life, Alan, it's precipitated more by kind of thoughts of aging. I mean, I would love to do more field work in a different kind of setting. But I think, realistically, I've been going now since '93, more or less every year, and I just have incredible amounts of data about this place, and
it's time to get it all together.
Yes.
There are one or two sort of general things. We touched on religion. Politics we sort of touched on briefly. You were against the establishment person in Sherborne, but that actually does relate to this last fieldwork, because when you came and talked in Cambridge, you were talking about a particular incident of someone who had been imprisoned who was a friend of yours. Do you want to talk at all about that? Because this will go out to the world, and it's a chance to tell the world about this incident, or would you rather...
Well, I'll say something very briefly about it. This is a man called Ajay. Ajay became my research assistant in Billai. He's Malayali, he comes from Kerala, and his family had moved to Billai in the late 50s, early 60s, working class people, sort of fringes of the lower middle class. And Ajay, when I met him, had been a sort of an agent for a very small company in Calcutta selling gearboxes to the steel plant, hated the job, became my research assistant, worked with Margaret, my wife, later, learning as one of the students on her, access students on her documentary film project, got involved in the civil rights movement, documented some police atrocities, and was picked up completely cynically and put in jail for 93 days. Eventually they had to let him out without charges. I should what more to say about this? I mean, I think I should say that very important to my ethnography has been this experience of working with research assistants, of whom Ajay was one. But still a very good friend of mine is the person who, in my second year in Kangra, was my research assistant in Kangra. And I've always worked with these people who have become extremely good personal friends, and generally have been people with real kind of intellectual interests, but not at all well educated in formal terms, and who've been amazingly important to the ethnography that I've been able to get.
That's a nice tribute. I mean, on this last instance, certainly at one point it was considered that anthropologists shouldn't become too involved with local politics in the practical sense, or interfering in any way. They were objective describers of situations.
Yes.
Has your view shifted on that, or have you always felt that if you saw injustices you should try and do something about it?
No, I'm very ambivalent about it, and somewhat mistrust anthropology that goes over too much into social activism. Partly because, I mean, it seems to me that there is an incompatibility between the anthropologist, sociologist task and the partisanship that is required of political activism. However, when you're extremely good friends, people in whose houses you have spent many months living, on whom, in many ways the success of your project has been dependent, and who you think are thoroughly admirable people, get picked on and incarcerated in jail, and all their friends desert them. What else can you do?
Well, I've got just one more question, and then we'll see if there's anything particular I left out. And that is that you've been going repeatedly back to India over the last 30, 40 years, and watched a country in which in the Bombay Stock Exchange they were wearing dhotis, and there probably wasn't a stock exchange, and there were just bullock carts on the roads. If you look at some of these early films in the 60s and 70s to what India is now. And many people comment on what is happening. What is your feelings about what is going to happen? Do you feel optimistic and enthusiastic about the dramatic transformation, or worried about how things are going?
It's interesting that we were talking, your last question was about Ajay. And I think that had you asked me that question a year ago, I would have given you perhaps a slightly different answer. But the answer that I give you now is that I feel deeply concerned about the proportion of the Indian population that are left out of all this and to whom basic rights of citizenship are effectively denied. Education, health, etc., etc. And for whom, democratic and for whom the democratic system and the legal apparatus basically does not work at all. So I feel a bit gloomy right at this moment. And I feel that the study that I've been doing, I think, is quite relevant to all this, because what you have is a working class in a place like Billai, part of which, or I should really say working classes, part of which, is a real aristocracy of labour that essentially has kind of been bought off or enjoys very privileged conditions, upwardly mobile, decent education, extremely good medical facilities, but basically, is not the same class as informal sector labour in terms of its sort of interests and the way it identifies itself, and basically has no interest whatever in political action on behalf of bottom of the heap construction workers and so forth. So I feel a bit kind of gloomy. This is all great for all but 1/3 of the population, but that third of the population is not doing well.
It's only a third, is it? I mean, some people would
Yes.
the ratio even worse.
Higher, yes.
Well, we've covered many things, and there are always more things in a life that one doesn't cover. But is there anything that you would have liked me to have asked you about, which I've conspicuously failed to do so?
I don't think so. I think I've said more than enough.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Johnny. That was lovely.